The girl hid from her stepfather in the barn. Then the horse protected her. Iris pressed her back against the barn wall, holding her breath as footsteps approached outside. The massive black stallion stood between her and the door, ears pinned back, muscles tensed like he was guarding something precious. But here's what made no sense. This horse had never seen her before tonight. 3 hours earlier, she was just another girl trying to stay invisible in her own home. Now she was trapped in an abandoned barn with a wild animal that refused to let her stepfather enter. The horse kept glancing at her with an intensity she couldn't understand, like he was remembering something. Malachi's voice cut through the darkness outside. "I know you're in there, girl. That horse don't scare me." But his footsteps had stopped moving closer. For the first time in months, something was protecting her. Something that had no reason to care whether she lived or died. The strangest part? The fresh straw beneath her feet was soaked with old bloodstains. Someone else had hidden here before. Someone who hadn't made it out. Malachi's voice cut through the darkness outside. "I know you're in there, girl. That horse don't scare me." But his footsteps had stopped moving closer. For the first time in months, something was protecting her from the man who made her life a nightmare. Earlier that evening, Iris had been washing dishes when she heard her mother, Cora, crying again. The sound came from the bedroom where Malachi had dragged her after another one of his rages. Iris gripped the plate tighter, knowing that soon he would come looking for someone else to hurt. She was right. The kitchen door slammed open, and Malachi filled the doorway, his shirt stained with whiskey, and his eyes bloodshot. "Your mother's been telling lies about me again," he growled, taking a step toward her. "Says I've been too rough with you." Iris backed against the sink, her heart pounding. She had learned to read the signs, the way his hands clenched into fists, the way his voice dropped to a whisper before he exploded. Tonight was going to be worse than usual. "Please, I didn't say nothing to her," Iris whispered, but Malachi was already reaching for his belt buckle, the same one that had left marks on her arms before. That's when she ran. Through the back door, across the moonlit yard, toward the only place she could think to hide, the old barn that had been abandoned since the previous owner died. She expected to find empty stalls and rotting wood. Instead, she found the black stallion waiting in the shadows like he had been expecting her. The horse was massive, with wild eyes and a coat that gleamed even in the dim light. Any normal animal would have bolted when she stumbled through the door, gasping and terrified. This one stepped forward and positioned himself between her and the entrance. Now, pressed against the barn wall with straw beneath her feet, Iris could hear Malachi pacing outside. His footsteps stopped right at the doorway, but he didn't enter. Through a gap in the wooden boards, she could see him standing there, staring at the stallion that blocked his path. "That animal's gonna tire out eventually," Malachi called out. "And when he does, you and me are gonna have a long talk about respect." The stallion snorted and stomped once, a sound that made Malachi take a step back. Iris noticed something then. Dark stains in the straw around her feet. Old stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Someone had been here before her, hiding in this same spot. But as she looked closer at the bloodstains, she realized they weren't just random splashes. They formed a pattern, like someone had been dragged across the floor. And in the far corner of the barn, partially hidden by moldy hay, she could see what looked like torn fabric. Someone else had run to this barn seeking safety. The question was, had they ever made it out alive? The torn fabric in the corner wasn't just any cloth. It was a piece of blue dress, the same color her mother had been wearing the day she first brought Malachi home. Iris crawled closer to examine it, her hands shaking as she picked up the blood-stained material. The stallion watched her movements carefully, occasionally glancing toward the door where Malachi's shadow still lurked. Every few minutes, her stepfather would call out threats, but he hadn't tried to enter. Something about this horse kept him at bay, and Iris was beginning to understand why. She found more evidence hidden beneath the hay. A woman's hair ribbon, brittle with age and stained dark. A small wooden button that had been torn from a blouse. And scratched into the barn wall, barely visible in the moonlight, were the words, "He killed me," carved with desperate fingers. Iris felt sick. This wasn't the first time Malachi had chased someone into this barn, and whoever had hidden here before her hadn't survived the encounter. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her mother hadn't been Malachi's first wife. Outside, Malachi's voice changed tactics. "Iris, honey, I'm sorry I scared you. Come on out and we'll talk about this like adults. Your mama's worried sick about you." She knew he was lying. Cora was probably locked in the bedroom, nursing whatever injuries he had given her this time. Malachi had perfected the art of hurting people just enough to keep them quiet, but not enough to raise suspicions in town. The stallion's ears flicked at the sound of Malachi's false concern, and he snorted softly, as if he recognized the deception too. Iris reached out slowly and touched the horse's neck. His coat was warm and solid, and she could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm. He didn't flinch away from her touch. "You've seen this before, haven't you?" she whispered to the animal. "You know what he's capable of." As if responding to her words, the stallion moved closer to the wall where the desperate message had been carved. He lowered his head and breathed softly against the scratched letters, then looked back at Iris with an expression that seemed almost human in its intensity. That's when she heard the sound that made her blood freeze, the squeak of rusty hinges. Malachi wasn't at the main door anymore. He was opening the side entrance to the barn, the one she had forgotten about in her panic. "Found another way in, didn't I?" His voice came from behind her now, much closer than before. "That horse might guard one door, but he can't guard them all." The stallion spun around, but he was on the wrong side of the barn now. Malachi stood between him and Iris, his face twisted in a cruel smile. In his hand, he held a rope that he was fashioning into a loop. "See, I know a thing or two about handling wild animals," Malachi said, advancing toward her, "and little girls who don't know their place." But as he raised the rope, the stallion did something unexpected. He reared up on his hind legs and let out a sound that wasn't quite a whinny and wasn't quite a scream. It was a call that echoed through the night air like a signal. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the barn, other horses answered. The sound of hooves thundering across the ground grew louder. Malachi's confident smile faltered as he realized the stallion hadn't been alone. Through the gaps in the barn walls, Iris could see shapes moving in the darkness. At least 6 wild horses surrounding the building. "What the hell?" Malachi muttered, his rope hanging loose in his hands. The horses outside weren't just random animals. They moved with purpose, blocking every exit from the barn. The stallion inside had called his herd, and they had answered. Iris pressed herself against the wall as Malachi spun around, suddenly trapped in the same barn where he had cornered his victims before. The wild horses outside began to circle the building, their hooves creating a steady rhythm that sounded like war drums in the night. "This is impossible," Malachi whispered, backing toward the center of the barn. "Animals don't act like this." But Iris was beginning to understand. She crawled back to the corner where she had found the torn dress and examined the fabric more carefully. Stitched into the seam was a small label with initials. M.B. Martha Brooks, Malachi's first wife, the one he claimed had died in an accident. The truth hit her like lightning. Martha hadn't died in any accident. She had run to this barn just like Iris, seeking shelter from the man who was supposed to protect her. But Martha hadn't been lucky enough to find the stallion waiting. Iris looked up at Malachi, who was now sweating despite the cool night air. "Her name was Martha, wasn't it? Your first wife?" Malachi's face went white. "How do you know that name?" "Because you killed her right here in this barn," Iris said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Just like you're planning to kill me." The stallion snorted and took a step toward Malachi, who raised the rope defensively. But the horse wasn't afraid of the makeshift weapon. If anything, he seemed to recognize it. Iris realized with growing horror that Malachi had probably used a rope on Martha too. "She was asking too many questions," Malachi said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said she was going to tell the sheriff about the marks on her arms. I couldn't let that happen." Outside, the wild horses had stopped circling. Now they stood perfectly still as if they were waiting for something. The silence was more terrifying than their thundering hooves had been. "You made one mistake," Iris said, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "You chose the wrong place to hurt people." Malachi laughed, but it sounded forced. "What's that supposed to mean?" "This barn belongs to them now." Iris nodded toward the stallion. "Martha's blood is in this ground, and they remember. Animals don't forget violence." As if to prove her point, the stallion moved closer to Malachi, his nostrils flaring. The horse wasn't showing aggression exactly. It was more like he was reading the man's scent, cataloging the smell of fear and cruelty. "They can smell what you did," Iris continued. "Blood doesn't wash away completely, especially not from wood." Malachi looked around at the barn walls, at the dark stains he had tried to hide under fresh hay, at the evidence of his crime that he thought was safely buried. For the first time since Iris had known him, He looked genuinely afraid. That's when they heard the sound that made Malachi's face go completely pale, the distant wail of sirens approaching through the night. The sirens grew louder, and Malachi's breathing became rapid and shallow. He looked around the barn like a trapped animal, realizing that the walls that had hidden his crime were now his prison. How did they know to come here? He demanded, grabbing Iris by the arm and yanking her to her feet. Did you tell someone? Iris winced as his fingers dug into her skin, but she shook her head. I didn't tell nobody, I ran straight here. The stallion stepped forward, his massive body moving between them again. This time, Malachi was desperate enough to swing the rope at the horse's head. The animal dodged easily and let out another piercing call that was answered immediately by the horses outside. Through the gaps in the barn walls, Iris could see flashing red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. The police cars were getting closer, and with them came the sound of voices calling her name. Iris! Iris, where are you? It was her mother's voice, raw with panic and fear. Cora was alive and had managed to call for help. Malachi cursed under his breath. Your mother always was too stubborn for her own good. I should have finished her off years ago like I did Martha. But you didn't, Iris said, pulling away from his grip. And now everyone's gonna know what you really are. The police cars stopped outside the barn, and car doors slammed shut. Heavy footsteps approached the building, along with the sound of radios crackling with official voices. This is Sheriff Hayes, a man called out. Malachi Brooks, we need you to come out with your hands visible. We have the building surrounded. Malachi's face twisted with rage and desperation. He looked at the stallion blocking his path, at the torn fabric that proved his guilt, at the bloodstains that would convict him. Then he looked at Iris with an expression that made her blood run cold. If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me, he whispered, pulling a knife from his boot. Just like I did your precious Martha. The stallion saw the blade and reared up on his hind legs, his hooves flashing dangerously close to Malachi's head. But the man ducked and lunged toward Iris, the knife aimed at her heart. That's when the barn door exploded inward. Sheriff Hayes and 2 deputies burst through the entrance, guns drawn and flashlights cutting through the darkness. The wild horses outside scattered at the sudden noise and light, but the stallion held his ground. Drop the weapon, Hayes shouted, his gun trained on Malachi. But Malachi was beyond reasoning now. With nothing left to lose, he raised the knife higher and took another step toward Iris. She knows too much, just like Martha did. The stallion moved faster than any of them expected. The massive horse slammed into Malachi's side with the force of a battering ram, sending the man flying across the barn. The knife went spinning through the air and landed harmlessly in a pile of hay. Malachi hit the far wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the ground, groaning and clutching his ribs. The deputies moved in quickly, handcuffs ready. As they hauled Malachi to his feet, he looked back at the stallion with a mixture of fear and hatred. That animal ain't natural, he mumbled through bloody lips. Animals don't act like that. Sheriff Hayes glanced at the horse, who was now standing calmly beside Iris, then at the evidence scattered around the barn floor. Maybe they do when they've seen enough evil, he said quietly. But even as the deputies led Malachi away, Iris could see the questions in the sheriff's eyes. How had a wild horse known to protect her? And why had an entire herd surrounded the barn like they were standing guard? Some mysteries, she realized, were better left unsolved. As the deputies drove away with Malachi in the back of their patrol car, Sheriff Hayes remained in the barn with Iris and the stallion. The wild horses outside had retreated to a safe distance but hadn't left completely. They stood watching from the tree line like silent sentinels. Your mother's in the ambulance getting checked out, Hayes told Iris gently. She's got some bruises and a broken wrist. But she's going to be fine. She was the one who called us. Iris nodded, relief flooding through her. She had feared the worst when she heard Cora crying earlier. Can you tell me what happened here tonight? The sheriff asked, pulling out a small notebook. His flashlight illuminated the evidence scattered across the barn floor. The torn dress, the hair ribbon, the bloodstains that told a story of violence. Iris explained how she had fled to the barn, how the stallion had protected her, and how she had discovered the remains of Martha Brooks. As she spoke, Hayes examined the carved message on the wall and the pattern of old bloodstains. Martha Brooks disappeared 5 years ago, Hayes said quietly. Malachi reported her missing, said she'd run off with another man. We searched for weeks but never found any trace of her. She never left, Iris said, touching the torn fabric. She died right here trying to hide from him just like I was. The sheriff nodded grimly. "We'll need to excavate this area, see if we can find more evidence. This barn is now a crime scene." As if understanding the conversation, the stallion moved closer to the far corner where the bloodstains were heaviest. He lowered his massive head and sniffed at a particular spot in the dirt floor. Then looked back at Hayes with an almost human expression of urgency. "He's trying to show us something," Iris said. Hayes approached carefully, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. The stallion didn't retreat but stood his ground, continuing to nose at the dirt. When the sheriff knelt down and brushed away the loose soil, his flashlight revealed something that made him suck in a sharp breath. Partially buried in the earth was a human bone. "Jesus," Hayes whispered, immediately standing and stepping back. "We're going to need the forensics team out here first thing in the morning." Iris felt sick, but not surprised. She had suspected they would find Martha's remains somewhere in this barn. What amazed her was how the stallion had known exactly where to look. "Sheriff," she said slowly, "I think this horse lived here before, when Martha was alive." Hayes looked at the stallion with new understanding. "You think he belonged to her?" "Maybe. Or maybe he just witnessed what Malachi did to her 5 years ago. Animals don't forget trauma like that. They remember dangerous people." As if confirming her theory, the stallion walked over to an old wooden post and rubbed his head against it affectionately. Hanging from a rusty nail was a frayed rope halter, the kind used to lead horses to pasture. It was small and delicate, clearly made for a more gentle touch than Malachi's rough hands. "Martha loved horses," Hayes said, recognition dawning in his voice. "Her neighbors used to complain about her feeding strays, said she had a way with wild animals that was almost—" He stopped himself before saying the word magical, but Iris understood what he meant. Some people just had a natural gift with animals. Martha had been one of those people, and it had probably made her horses protective of this place even after her death. That's why they came when he called, Iris realized. They remember her, and they remember what Malachi did. The stallion nickered softly, as if agreeing with her assessment. Then he walked to the barn door and stood there waiting, looking back at them expectantly. "I think he wants us to follow him," Hayes said. "There might be more evidence outside." But as they stepped out of the barn, they discovered something that made the entire night even more tragic, and more hopeful than Iris had dared to imagine. The stallion led them to a grove of trees behind the barn, where moonlight filtered through the branches to reveal something that took Iris's breath away. Scattered among the roots were dozens of small wooden crosses, each one marking a carefully tended grave. "What is this place?" Hayes whispered, his flashlight revealing the extent of the makeshift cemetery. Iris knelt beside one of the crosses and read the crude carving. Buttercup, good dog. Another read, Midnight, faithful friend. The graves were small, meant for pets and farm animals that had been buried with love and respect. Martha made this, Iris realized. She was burying animals that died on the property. The stallion walked to a larger grave at the center of the grove, one marked with a stone instead of a wooden cross. As Hayes's flashlight illuminated the marker, they could see it was engraved with a single word, Hope. Hope was probably her favorite horse, Hayes said quietly, the one that died before Malachi killed her. But there was something else near the stone that made Iris's heart race. Partially hidden beneath fallen leaves was a metal box, the kind used to store important documents. The stallion nudged it with his nose, then looked up at them expectantly. Hayes carefully lifted the box and opened it. Inside were letters, photographs, and legal documents that told the story of Martha Brooks's final months. There was a deed to the property showing that Martha, not Malachi, had been the rightful owner of the land. There were medical records documenting injuries that she had attributed to accidents, but which clearly showed a pattern of abuse. Most importantly, there was a letter addressed to the sheriff's department, dated just days before Martha's disappearance. She was planning to leave him, Hayes said, reading the letter by flashlight. She had hidden money saved up and was going to file charges against him for domestic violence. Iris looked through the photographs and found images of Martha with her horses. The woman had been young and pretty, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. In several pictures, she was feeding or grooming horses that looked exactly like the ones surrounding the barn tonight. "These are the same horses," Iris said with wonder. "They've been here all along, waiting." "Waiting for what?" Hayes asked. "For justice," Iris replied. "For someone to find the truth about what happened to Martha." The stallion whinnied softly and began walking back toward the barn. The other horses followed, forming a loose procession through the trees. As they emerged into the clearing, Iris saw her mother sitting in the back of the ambulance with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Cora looked up and saw Iris approaching with the sheriff. Relief flooded her face, followed quickly by shame and regret. "I'm so sorry, baby," Cora called out. "I should have protected you better. I should have left him years ago." Iris ran to her mother and embraced her carefully, mindful of her injuries. "It's not your fault, Mama. He fooled everybody." "Not everybody," Hayes said, looking back at the horses. "Martha's animals knew what kind of man he was, and tonight they made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else." As dawn began to break over the horizon, casting golden light across the property, the wild horses started to disperse. One by one, they melted back into the forest until only the stallion remained. He stood near the barn door, watching as the forensics team arrived to begin their investigation. When Iris approached him one final time, he lowered his great head and allowed her to stroke his neck. "Thank you," she whispered, "for protecting me, for remembering Martha." The stallion looked at her with those intelligent eyes one last time, then turned and galloped away to join his herd. As he disappeared into the trees, Iris knew that Martha Brooks could finally rest in peace. But there was still one more surprise waiting for them, one that would change Iris and Cora's lives forever. 3 weeks later, Iris sat in the county courthouse watching as Judge Morrison read the charges against Malachi Brooks. The forensics team had found enough evidence in the barn to build an airtight case for Martha's murder, and the medical records from the hidden box proved years of domestic violence. "Malachi Brooks, you are hereby charged with first-degree murder in the death of Martha Brooks, attempted murder of Iris Quaid, and aggravated domestic violence against Cora Lane," the judge announced. "Given the severity of these crimes and the evidence presented, I am setting bail at $5 million. Malachi sat in his orange jumpsuit, his face pale and defeated. Without the bluster and intimidation that had defined him for so long, he looked like what he truly was, a coward who preyed on those weaker than himself. After the hearing, Sheriff Hayes approached Iris and Cora in the courthouse hallway. "There's something else you need to know," he said, holding a manila folder. "The county attorney's office has been reviewing Martha's will and property deeds." Cora frowned. "What does that have to do with us?" "Everything," Hayes replied, opening the folder. "Martha Brooks owned that property outright before she married Malachi. When she died without a will, the land should have gone to the state. But there's a complication." He handed them a legal document that made Iris's eyes widen. It was a marriage certificate showing that Malachi's marriage to Martha had never been legally dissolved before he married Cora. "What does this mean?" Cora asked, struggling to read the legal language. "It means your marriage to Malachi Brooks was never valid," Hayes explained. "He was still legally married to Martha when he wed you. In the eyes of the law, you were never his wife." The implications of this revelation hit Iris like a thunderbolt. If Cora had never been legally married to Malachi, then all of his claims to the property were fraudulent. Since Martha died without a will, and her marriage to Malachi will be invalidated due to his conviction for her murder. "The property enters a legal gray area," Hayes continued. "But the county attorney believes there's a strong case for awarding it to you, Cora, as compensation for the years of abuse you suffered while living there under false pretenses." Cora stared at the papers in disbelief. "You're saying we might own the land where Martha died?" "More than that," Hayes said with a slight smile. "The property includes 40 acres of prime pasture land, the barn, and mineral rights that could be worth a considerable sum. Martha came from a wealthy family who left her well provided for." As they drove back to the temporary shelter where they had been staying, Iris thought about the implications of owning Martha's land. It felt strange to inherit something that had been the site of so much tragedy, but it also felt like justice. "What do you think we should do with it?" Cora asked as they pulled into the parking lot. Iris had been thinking about that very question. "I want to fix up the barn," she said. "Turn it into a proper stable for rescue horses." "Martha would have liked that." Cora smiled, and for the first time in years it reached her eyes. "I think that's a beautiful idea, baby." That night, as they lay in their narrow shelter beds, Iris thought she heard something familiar outside the window. She got up quietly and looked out to see a familiar silhouette standing at the edge of the parking lot. The black stallion was there, watching over them even in this strange place. When he saw her at the window, he nickered softly and then disappeared back into the darkness. Some protectors, Iris realized, never truly leave. 6 months later, Iris stood in the doorway of the renovated barn, watching as a young colt took his first tentative steps in the clean straw. The building that had once been a place of horror was now a sanctuary for injured and abandoned horses. Malachi Brooks had been convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial had lasted 3 days, with the evidence so overwhelming that the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. He would never hurt anyone again. "How's he doing?" Cora asked, joining Iris at the barn door. Her mother's face had filled out in the months since they had moved to the property, and the constant fear that had haunted her eyes was finally gone. "Better every day," Iris replied, watching the colt nuzzle his mother's flank. "Doc Peterson says his leg should heal completely." They had turned Martha's 40 acres into exactly what the woman would have wanted, a horse rescue operation that specialized in animals that had been abused or neglected. Word had spread quickly through the county, and they now housed 12 horses in various stages of recovery. The barn itself bore no resemblance to the place where Iris had hidden in terror. They had torn out the old wooden walls where Martha's final message had been carved, replacing them with clean pine boards and proper ventilation. The blood-stained floor had been completely excavated and replaced with rubber mats over concrete. In the corner where Martha's remains had been found, they had planted a small garden of wildflowers. A simple stone marker read, "Martha Brooks, friend to all creatures." It was the memorial she had never received. "Look who's here," Cora said, pointing toward the pasture fence. The black stallion stood at the gate, as he did every evening around sunset. He had never come close enough to be touched again, but he watched over the property like a silent guardian. The other horses from his herd occasionally grazed in the far pasture, keeping their distance but somehow adding to the feeling of protection that surrounded the place. "He's waiting for his apple," Iris said, pulling the fruit from her jacket pocket. This had become their daily ritual. Iris would leave an apple on the fence post, and the stallion would take it after she walked away. It was his way of accepting their presence while maintaining his wild independence. As Iris placed the apple on the post, she thought about how much her life had changed. The scared girl who had hidden in this barn was gone, replaced by a young woman who had found her purpose in caring for animals that had suffered like she had. "Dinner's ready," Cora called from the house they had built on the hill overlooking the pastures. Iris took one last look at the stallion, who was already approaching the fence for his evening treat. "Thank you," she whispered as she did every night. The horse looked up at her with those intelligent dark eyes, then lowered his head to eat the apple. In that moment, Iris felt the presence of Martha Brooks, not as a ghost or spirit, but as the legacy of kindness that lived on in this place. As she walked toward the house where warm light spilled from the windows, Iris knew that some endings were really beginnings. The property that had witnessed so much pain was now a place of healing, and the horses that roamed these fields would never know fear again. Behind her, the stallion finished his apple and galloped into the gathering darkness free and protected, just as Martha would have wanted. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where courage and justice collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.
A wounded German shepherd puppy, abandoned in the woods. A lynx cub, barely breathing, tangled in wire and left to die. But when she cried, he stayed. When she bled, he shielded her with his body. No one knew how long they had been lying there together. But what he did next, with torn paws and a breaking heart, changed everything. What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The sun had barely risen over the mist-shrouded pines of Everpeen, Oregon, and the forest felt like it had forgotten how to breathe. The air hung heavy with dew and silence, broken only by the occasional whisper of damp leaves brushing against each other. It was early October, and the Cascade National Forest wore a thin veil of fog that coiled around the trunks of the ancient cedars like ghosts reluctant to leave. The chill had bite to it. Not quite winter, but enough to sting bare skin and cloud breath in the morning air. Mara Collins, 42, trudged steadily up the muddy slope of the South Ridge Trail. She wasn't tall average height, with a sturdy frame built more from stubbornness than strength. Her auburn hair was streaked with silver and always twisted into a tight knot at the nape of her neck, as if order and control could somehow be knotted into permanence. Her ranger's jacket, sun-faded green with worn elbow patches, hung loose over her frame. She rarely smiled anymore, not since the accident 3 years ago. Her daughter, Lena, had wandered off trail during a family camping trip in this very forest, and never returned. Search parties found a boot, later a piece of cloth, but never Lena. Since then, Mara walked these woods with the weight of loss wrapped around her like armor. She spoke little to others and even less to herself. Nature didn't need words, and lately neither did she. This morning was meant to be routine: check the perimeter fencing, inspect fallen branches after last night's wind, log any signs of wildlife migration. But even as her boots pressed into the soft earth, something felt wrong. The silence wasn't natural. Not the kind of peace that settles over the mountains after a storm, but the brittle hush that precedes something breaking. Then she heard it. A low, ragged whimper, almost buried beneath the rustle of wet leaves. Not the call of a bird, not the hiss of wind. Pain. Living pain. She followed the sound off trail, crouching low as ferns brushed against her knees. Her gloved hand parted a curtain of mossy branches and stopped. There, barely visible beneath the twisted arms of a thorned underbrush, lay a sight that cleaved clean through her numbness. A German shepherd puppy, no more than 6 months old, his light sable coat dulled by mud and matted in places with blood, lay across something else. At first, Mara thought it was a bundle of leaves. Then she saw the faint rise and fall of a narrow chest, the twitch of a small, spotted ear. A lynx cub. Its fur, once probably thick and soft, was patchy with dried blood and bramble cuts. One hind leg was twisted unnaturally, and its breaths came in rapid, shallow gasps. The cub was barely hanging on, but the dog, he was shielding her with his body like a living blanket, one front paw limp and bleeding where it had caught on something sharp. He didn't bark, didn't growl when Mara moved closer. He just looked up, eyes wide and alert, as if daring her to come closer but too tired to fight. Mara froze. This wasn't survival instinct. This wasn't prey and predator. This was a choice. The dog had chosen to stay, to guard, even in pain. She crouched slowly, keeping her palms out. "Easy," she murmured. "I'm not here to hurt either of you." The pup's ears twitched, but he didn't move. He was soaked to the bone, legs trembling with effort, but still, he stayed. She reached for her radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Collins. I need medical assistance at Marker 6, Wildcat juvenile, wounded, and a stray dog, severely injured, possibly bonded. I'll remain on scene." No answer yet. The forest swallowed her voice like it swallowed everything. She turned back and took in the details. The lynx cub's side was gashed, most likely from a wire fence, old and half buried in the dirt nearby. There were drag marks, blood droplets, and crushed leaves trailing from the broken fencing toward this clearing. The puppy must have pulled the cub here. No, not just pulled, rescued. Mara's heart, usually so armored it felt stone-set, cracked open just a little. "You stupid, brave thing," she whispered. He blinked slowly at her, and she thought she saw something familiar in his gaze. Not intelligence, though that was there too, but loss, recognition, like he knew what it was to lose someone you couldn't protect. She thought of Lena's boot, lying in the mud beside a fallen log, and her voice almost broke. "You did good," she whispered again. When the team arrived late, due to a downed tree on the trail, Mara didn't move. She stayed kneeling beside them, one hand resting gently on the pup's uninjured shoulder as the wildlife medic approached. "She's still alive," the medic said, checking the lynx. "Barely. If we hadn't come now." "She wouldn't have made it," Mara finished, voice hollow. "And the pup?" another ranger asked. Mara stood slowly, her knees aching. "He stays with her." "You sure?" "I'm sure." They prepared 2 stretchers, one for the lynx cub, one for the dog. When they lifted the lynx first, the puppy stirred. He struggled to his feet, body shaking, but forced himself up and limped after her. "Let him go," Mara said quickly. The medics paused, looked at each other, then nodded. And so the dog followed the cub all the way to the edge of the woods, bleeding, trembling, but never once looking away. Mara watched from a distance. Something inside her shifted, not fully healed but alive. For the first time in years, she felt something besides cold. She would later learn the dog had no tag, no chip, no collar. No one came forward to claim him. But in that moment, as the mist gave way to pale morning sun, she knew one thing for certain. He wasn't lost. He had found something worth staying for. The rescue center at Everpine sat nestled beneath a crescent of pine-covered hills, its roof damp from lingering fog and the wooden ramp slick with morning dew. It wasn't a large facility, more of a converted ranger outpost than a proper wildlife shelter, but it did what it could. Inside, the scent of antiseptic mixed with wet fur, and the quiet buzz of heating vents working overtime against the mountain chill. On a padded table in the rear medical alcove, the lynx cub lay curled in on itself, a limp curl of pale-spotted fur and breath so shallow the vet kept checking to be sure it was still there. A nameplate hadn't been written yet. To the staff, it was just the cub, but to Mara, it already had a name, Ash, because it looked like something fragile and fading, barely glowing in a world too cold. Beside the exam table, Shadow refused to lie down. The 6-month-old German shepherd was a canvas of hardship, his coat, once a golden sable now dulled to the color of old straw and soil, ribs faintly visible beneath the dirt-caked fur. His right front paw was bandaged after being cleaned and stitched, yet he refused rest. He stood alert, head low, ears twitching every time Ash stirred, eyes locked on the cub like a soldier on guard. When one of the shelter techs, a young man named Riley Torres, leaned a little too close to check Ash's IV line, Shadow let out a low, vibrating growl not of threat, but warning. Riley, a soft-spoken man in his 20s with a kind face and nervous eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses, stepped back immediately. "He's not aggressive," he muttered to Mara, "just focused." Mara didn't answer. She was watching too. It had been less than an hour since they'd arrived, but she already knew Shadow wouldn't stay here. She'd made the offer quietly, not as an impulse, but as something she hadn't realized had been growing in her chest for years. "If he can't be kept here," she'd said to the center's director, "I'll take him." The director, Janine Holbrook, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with short, salt-and-pepper hair and the gait of someone who had been working in boots most of her adult life. She respected Mara's quiet reputation but didn't sugarcoat her words. "He's feral, or close to it," she said, crossing her arms. "Not chipped. No proof he was ever owned. We don't house dogs here unless they're part of a case." "I'm not asking you to keep him," Mara replied, "just to let me take him." Janine studied her, then nodded once. "You want the responsibility, it's yours." By mid-morning, Shadow was in the back of Mara's old SUV, curled in a tight ball on a faded blanket. He hadn't resisted when she opened the hatch, hadn't needed coaxing. But he also hadn't looked at her. His eyes were fixed on the tree line beyond the shelter, as if part of him was still there, watching Ash disappear into the doors he couldn't follow through. Her cabin sat on the edge of Everpine, just outside the main town. A small log structure tucked between a cluster of redwoods like it was hiding from the world. The porch sagged slightly in the center, and the windows were always fogged with breath in colder months. Inside, it was clean but sparse, simple furniture, earth tones, and a stone fireplace that rarely saw use except in winter. Mara set down a shallow dish of food near the hearth, laid out a folded wool blanket near the back door, then stood back, unsure if she expected anything. Shadow walked inside without being called. He didn't sniff around, didn't explore. He moved straight to the back door and lay down, nose pressed against the bottom gap where wind leaked in, eyes pointed to the forest beyond the porch steps. He didn't touch the food. Mara watched him in silence, the way his shoulders rose and fell, not deeply, but controlled. The slight tension in his tail even when resting. He was listening. For what, she didn't know. Perhaps for Ash's breath. Perhaps for a rustle in the woods that would never come. She didn't try to pet him. She didn't give him commands. She knew better than to break something barely holding itself together. Later that afternoon, Mara sat at her kitchen table, flipping slowly through a box of old photos she hadn't touched in years. The edges were curled, faded. Lena smiling on a hike. Lena with a pine cone too big for her small hands. Lena with a yellow raincoat by the stream just 2 miles from where she had disappeared. She thought of Shadow lying beside Ash in the woods, of the way he had dragged her through bramble and wire to that patch of leaves. Something about it, about him, refused to let go of her mind. She looked toward the door. Shadow had not moved. The first night, she left the back porch light on. Not for him, but for whatever piece of him might still be lost out there. He didn't sleep. At least, not fully. She could hear the occasional shift of his paws, the low exhale that meant he was watching something only he could see. Just before dawn, Mara stood by the window with a cup of black coffee gone cold and whispered, "Shadow." The name didn't echo. It simply sat there in the air between them. He turned his head just slightly, ears lifting. Not in confusion, not even in curiosity, more like recognition, as if he knew it already. She said it again. "Shadow." This time, his head dipped just a bit, then settled back down. Outside, the fog was lifting, just enough to reveal the sharp outlines of the ridge beyond the cabin, just enough to see the way the shadows of the trees stretched long and quiet across the ground. The wind that swept through Everpine that evening carried a gentler chill than nights before. But it wasn't the cold that kept Mara up. It was the soundlessness. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, but expectant. The kind that pressed against the windows like it was waiting to hear something. She stood in the kitchen, arms folded, listening to the hush that filled the cabin like a tide. Behind her, Shadow still lay near the back door, eyes open, body unmoving, as if made of stone. He had not eaten since noon, and his water bowl was still full. She wondered if he ever slept, or if he simply endured the hours the way a tree endures wind, by standing still, by waiting it out. Out in the woods, under that bruised half-moon, Ash was still at the rescue center, hooked to tubes and monitors, breathing in shallow sips. The cub's vitals had dipped dangerously low that afternoon. The on-site vet, Dr. Nadine Keller, had gently told Mara not to expect too much. Nadine was in her late 40s, lean and precise, with tightly coiled black hair and steady hands. She'd worked with mountain wildlife for over 2 decades and didn't waste time on sugar-coated lies. "She's fighting," she said softly, "but I don't know if it'll be enough. Her temperature's still unstable, and she hasn't responded to physical contact. Then, after a pause, "Unless it's from that dog." Shadow hadn't been allowed back into the medical wing, but the staff noted that Ash had flinched less when Shadow's voice-low, hoarse whines and brief, hollow barks echoed from outside. That night, Mara didn't turn on the porch light. She left the curtains open instead, letting the pale light of the moon stretch across the floorboards, across Shadow's back, catching the patchy streaks of tan fur on his shoulders. He had begun to breathe heavier, as if sleep were hovering just beyond reach. And then, as the moon rose higher and the forest settled into its ghostly stillness, Shadow sat up. Not abruptly, not startled. He rose with the slow, aching motion of something waking from too long a stillness. He lifted his head toward the window. His ears turned slightly. And then he howled. It wasn't a loud, aggressive call. It wasn't even full of pain. It was soft, strained, a mourning sound. A tone soaked in longing and shaped by something deeper than instinct. It rose and wavered and died in the night air like a forgotten prayer. And for a moment, the world held its breath. Mara had never heard anything like it. Not from a wolf, not from a dog. It was a cry of waiting, of remembering, of refusing to forget. Her throat tightened, and without understanding why, she sat down on the floor beside him. Shadow did not move, but his eyes briefly flicked toward her, then back to the woods. The next morning, just after sunrise, Mara's niece arrived. Ellie was 12, pale with a spatter of freckles across her cheeks and long chestnut hair braided down her back. She wore a navy hoodie with the sleeves pulled over her knuckles and carried a sketch pad that she never let go of. Ellie had been through a difficult year. Her mother had recently relocated to Portland for work, and Ellie more comfortable with rabbits than people had asked to stay with Mara for the fall. At school, she'd been quiet, bookish, and too emotionally open, which made her a target for a group of louder girls who saw softness as weakness. Her therapist had said animal connection might help. Mara hadn't disagreed. When Ellie walked into the cabin, Shadow rose cautiously and stared at her. He didn't growl, he didn't back away, he just observed. Ellie froze in the doorway, hugging the sketch pad against her chest. "That's him?" she asked. Mara nodded. Shadow took one step toward the girl, then another. And then he sat. Ellie looked at him for a long while, then slowly knelt down, keeping her body turned slightly sideways in the universal language of non-threat. "Hi," she whispered. "I'm Ellie." Her voice barely carried. "I saw you on the news clip. You're brave." Shadow didn't move, but his ears tilted forward slightly. Then he blinked once. Mara watched as something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Ellie slowly opened her sketch pad and held it up to show him a half-finished drawing. It was rough, pencil lines light and tentative. The image was unmistakable. A dog curled around a small creature beneath a tree, moonlight breaking through the canopy. "I drew this last night," she murmured. "I think it's you." Shadow lowered his head, and for the first time since he entered the cabin, he let someone other than Mara sit beside him. Later that afternoon, Mara took Ellie to the rescue center. Ash was still in critical condition, but her breathing had evened slightly. Dr. Keller met them at the door, her white coat smudged and her eyes tired. "No real change," she said quietly, but she twitched when we played the recording of the dog's howl. Mara blinked. "You recorded it?" "Riley did," she said, nodding toward the younger tech. "He said he had a hunch." Ellie stepped up beside Mara. "Can I see her?" Dr. Keller hesitated, then nodded, quietly. The medical wing was warm, sterile, humming with soft machines. Ash lay in the same spot, her side rising slowly, her paw occasionally jerking with some inner dream or nerve reflex. Ellie approached gently, crouched beside the glass enclosure. She didn't speak, just sat and sketched, her pencil moving in soft strokes. After 10 minutes, Ash's ear twitched. Shadow, who had waited with Mara in the adjacent hallway, stood up suddenly. His tail rose, and he gave a single, sharp bark, not loud but precise. Inside the medical wing, Ash opened one eye. Dr. Keller blinked. "She's awake." No one said a word. Outside, the fog had begun to lift again. It moved up the hills like breath finally being exhaled. The rain had returned to Everpine, not in angry sheets, but as a soft, rhythmic drizzle that draped the forest in silver. The trees outside the rescue center bowed gently, their branches wet with quiet, and the gravel lot was speckled with puddles that reflected the overcast sky. Inside the clinic wing, the air was warmer and still carried the smell of pine cleaner and damp fur. It had been 4 days since Ash had opened her eyes, and though her condition remained fragile, there was now a flicker of something new. Awareness. Ash no longer lay completely curled into herself. Her head rested sideways, occasionally lifting a few inches when footsteps echoed through the corridor or when the wind moaned through the window seams. Her right paw twitched sometimes, and though she hadn't yet stood, the way her ears rotated toward sounds meant she was hearing feeling again. Mara sat on the padded bench just outside the enclosure, next to Ellie, who had her sketchpad balanced on her knees. The girl had become a fixture at the rescue center, quietly following the staff, observing Shadow and drawing. Today, she was working on a piece that showed Shadow's face up close, his amber eyes captured in fine graphite strokes. The shading was surprisingly mature for a 12-year-old. Ellie had always drawn well, but now her art was different, more precise, more intimate. Her therapist might have called it progress. Mara just called it truth. Inside the cub's enclosure, Ash stirred as a low rumble began to build from the hallway. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't even loud. It was a sound that had become familiar to the staff in recent days, a short, restrained growl that Shadow only made when he was near Ash but separated by distance or barrier. He had come with Mara and Ellie again today, and as soon as they entered the center he had walked straight to the corner near the glass wall where Ash rested. His body remained still, but his tail stiffened. That sound, like a question drawn in gravel, vibrated again from his chest. Ash blinked. "She hears him," Ellie whispered. "I know," Mara said softly. Then, for the first time, Ash pushed her chin forward, barely but unmistakably. Her small body trembled with the effort, and her breath caught, but she didn't stop. Shadow's ears perked, and he inched closer to the glass partition, lowering his head until it almost met hers through the clear divide. Dr. Keller, watching from the side, gave a slow nod. "Let's try something." She returned a few minutes later with a plan and a long list of cautionary points, but Mara nodded through every one. Shadow had shown no aggression toward Ash. If anything, he treated her with the kind of reverence few animals gave to another species. The decision was made. They opened the side door to Ash's recovery unit. The cub was too weak to move far, and Shadow was still partially lame, though his stitched paw was healing. As the door creaked open, Shadow stepped through without hesitation. He approached slowly, ears slightly back in deference, posture low and careful. Mara held her breath. Ellie did too. Shadow reached Ash's side and paused. Then he lowered his head and gently pressed his nose to the top of her snout. The moment stretched. Ash shuddered. And then, impossibly, she stretched out her front paw and brushed it against his. Dr. Keller blinked. "That's the first voluntary movement she's made." Shadow licked the side of her nose once. Ash didn't flinch. An hour later, Ash drank milk from a bottle for the first time since her arrival. Ellie captured it all in pencil. She sketched fast and quiet, flipping from one page to another like she was documenting a miracle frame by frame. The way Shadow lay curled beside Ash, the gentle pressure of his nose against her fur, the way Ash's eyes, once glazed with pain, now followed Shadow's movements as if tethered to them by something unseen. That night at home, Ellie showed the drawings to Mara. The pages were filled with moments, small, delicate expressions between the two animals that a camera might have missed. In one, Ash's paw rested on Shadow's leg. In another, Shadow's eyes were closed, but his body curved protectively around her. "They're not just pictures," Ellie said, flipping to a new page. "They're how I know what feelings look like." Mara looked at the drawing, a close-up of Ash's gaze, and felt something tighten in her throat. It reminded her of a photo that had once sat on her mantel. Lena, arms wrapped around a stray tabby kitten, both of them looking into the lens with the same quiet awe. She hadn't looked at that photo in over 2 years. "You want to frame one?" she asked, voice low. Ellie blinked. "Really?" "Really." They chose a page together. It was the one where Ash had stretched out her paw for the first time, her eyes half closed, trusting. Later that evening, as the rain whispered against the cabin's metal roof, Mara sat alone in the den, the drawing framed and set beside the fireplace. Shadow lay at the back door as always, but this time his breathing was slower, more even. Every now and then, he'd lift his head, sniff the air, then lay it back down with a quiet sigh. It was the first time Mara had seen him show any sign of peace. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. The days grew shorter in Everpine, and the drizzle that had once gently kissed the cabin roof now hammered with insistence. By late October, the ground had soaked through, and the trails behind Mara's home had turned to slick veins of mud and fallen needles. Inside the cabin, though, warmth began to return, not just in temperature, but in presence. The hearth flickered every evening now, and the air no longer hung with silence, but with the soft creaks of movement, breathing, and life. Ash was healing. Slowly, delicately, but undeniably. Each day at the rescue center she stood for a few more seconds. Her gait remained shaky, and her back legs still trembled when she shifted weight, but her eyes followed movement now. She'd begun batting gently at toys placed in her enclosure and sometimes curled up close to the corner where Shadow had last sat. The staff noted it in their logs, calling it positive behavioral response to external stimulus, but Ellie, after watching for 10 minutes, said simply, "She misses him." Shadow, too, had changed. He began eating again, not eagerly but without reluctance. He followed Mara through the house and allowed Ellie to sit close while sketching. Sometimes, when she would talk to him in that gentle murmur she used only for him, he'd rest his head near her lap, amber eyes soft but still searching. He even wagged his tail once briefly, like it surprised him. But then came the storm. It arrived sudden and heavy, sweeping down from the mountains in a tantrum of wind and sleet. That night, Mara had just finished setting wood by the fireplace when Shadow stood abruptly. His body tensed, and his ears flattened. A low growl rolled from his throat, different than before. Not protective, not curious. This was deeper, rawer. Ellie froze where she sat, sketchpad halfway open, watching him. "Shadow," Mara said gently. He didn't respond. His eyes locked on the window, not as if he saw something, but as if he remembered it. He refused food that night, and the next, and the one after. He began pacing again, a tight circle near the door, nose pressed against the bottom edge as if expecting it to open from the other side. Mara checked his paw, no sign of re-injury. His vitals were stable, but something inside him had shifted, retreated. It was on the 4th day without eating that Mara noticed the mark. She'd been brushing the dirt from his flank after an unusually muddy walk. When her hand moved to the underside of his neck, just below the thick scruff of fur, she felt it. Rough scar tissue, a raised ring slightly pink under the skin. She parted the fur gently and stared. A scar, circular, right where a collar would have dug in tight, too tight. She hadn't noticed before he'd never let her touch him there. Ellie knelt beside her, eyes wide. "What's that?" "I think it's from a chain," Mara murmured. Shadow's breathing picked up, and he pulled back a few inches. Not a snap, not fear, just instinctive distance. Later that afternoon, Mara drove to the place where she'd first found him and Ash. Not far from the tangled fence, hidden under a rotted log and leaves now half decayed, she found something she hadn't expected. A strip of leather, cracked and darkened with weather. It was a collar, worn and nearly unrecognizable but still intact. On the inner side, barely legible under dirt and age, a name was stamped into the leather. Blitz. She didn't say the name out loud until they were home. Ellie sat at the kitchen table, sketching Ash from memory, when Mara placed the collar down gently in front of her. "I found this where we first saw them." Ellie leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "What does it say?" "Blitz," Mara said softly. She hadn't expected a reaction, but Shadow, who had been lying near the door, still and watchful, stood up so fast the rug slipped beneath his paws. His breath came in short bursts. His head lowered. His eyes widened. Not in fear, but recognition so sharp it cut through every wall he had built. "Shadow," Ellie whispered. The name seemed to fade. "Blitz," she said, and the dog flinched. He backed away, tail low, body trembling, not as a threat, but like someone being yanked back through time. Mara moved slowly to kneel beside him. "Is that your name?" He didn't answer, of course, but his breathing slowed. He stared at her, then at Ellie, then at the collar. He walked to it, sat beside it, lay down. They didn't say the name again that night. Instead, Mara tucked the collar into a wooden drawer and returned to the floor where Shadow lay. "You're Shadow now," she whispered, stroking his side gently. "And you're safe." Outside, the storm passed quietly into the night, and for the first time in days, Shadow's breathing evened out as he closed his eyes. The sun returned to Everpine like a reluctant guest, pushing through the haze with quiet warmth that softened the moss-covered branches and warmed the planks of Mara's porch. It had been 2 weeks since Ash first touched her paw to Shadow's. In that time, the little lynx had transformed, not rapidly, but with the quiet perseverance of something born to survive. Her frame remained thin, her steps cautious, but she moved now. Slowly, uncertainly, but with a will that brought silence to everyone who watched. The enclosure at the rescue center had been expanded to include a small outdoor extension, soft soil, low logs, and brush meant to simulate the edge of a forest. Ash had begun to explore it in the mornings, legs still trembling, but no longer collapsing beneath her. Her fur had regained a soft luster, though the scar along her hind leg remained bare. She often circled the perimeter, pausing to sniff the bark or sit in the sun. And always, when she walked, Shadow would be there, just outside the enclosure, sitting with his tail curled neatly around his paws, eyes tracking her every movement. He never barked, never tried to breach the barrier. He simply watched. "He's like a sentinel," said Luis Delgado, one of the newer staff members at the rescue center. Luis was in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark, curly hair, always tucked beneath a knit beanie. He had a soft spot for orphaned raccoons, but approached his job with quiet competence. He nodded toward Shadow from behind the observation glass. I don't think he even blinks when she moves. Mara stood beside him with her arms folded, her ranger's jacket draped over one shoulder. "He's not guarding her anymore," she said after a pause. "He's letting her go." Luis looked over. "That's even harder, isn't it?" She didn't answer, but her expression did. Ellie had been more present at the center than ever. She now carried 2 sketch pads, one for drawings, and one filled with notes, times, dates, behavior patterns. When asked, she shrugged and said it was just for herself. In truth, it had begun as a project for school, but she didn't tell anyone that the assignment had long since ended. She just kept coming. One afternoon, while sitting near the far side of the enclosure, Ellie pulled a small object from her backpack. A wildlife trail camera, palm-sized and easily mountable. It wasn't professional grade, but it had motion sensors and a wide lens. She'd saved up for it over the summer. Quietly, when the staff had stepped out to tend to a hawk in rehab, she secured it to a beam in the enclosure wall where it faced both Ash's favorite log and the outer fence where Shadow often sat. She didn't ask permission. The next morning, the footage was downloaded, edited, and clipped into a short 2-minute compilation she uploaded to a private folder online. It showed Ash, tentative and blinking in the morning light, emerging from her den. Shadow was already in frame, unmoving. Ash limped a few steps forward, paused, looked toward him. He didn't move. Ash blinked once. Then she walked. The footage ended with her curling onto the sun-warmed soil, and Shadow turning his head just slightly, as if satisfied. Ellie emailed the clip to Dr. Keller, who surprisingly sent it to the rescue center's outreach coordinator, a woman named Tina Marsh. Tina, in her 40s, was brisk and efficient, with sharp cheekbones and brighter lipstick than one might expect from someone who worked mostly behind a desk. She had a background in nonprofit storytelling and understood viral content when she saw it. She posted the video titled simply, "The Watcher and the Wild," on the center's official social media page with a caption that read, "Recovery is rarely done alone. Sometimes survival looks like sitting still until someone else learns to walk again." The video took off. Within 48 hours, it had been shared over 20,000 times. By the end of the week, national animal welfare pages had reposted it. Comments poured in. People asked for updates. Some sent donations. Others sent collars, chew toys, and paw balm. A 3rd-grade class from Denver wrote letters addressed to Shadow and Ash, decorated with hand-drawn paw prints. Mara hadn't expected it to affect her. She had watched people grieve publicly on the internet before, reacting to dogs who waited by graves, cats who nursed abandoned ducklings, raccoons that hugged rescued puppies. She thought this was just another story among many. But one evening, after rereading a comment from a woman in Michigan who wrote, "I haven't walked in years, but today I did." Because of this, she turned off her screen and went outside. Shadow was in his usual place by the porch, resting with his head on his paws, eyes half-lidded but aware. Mara sat beside him on the step, knees pulled to her chest. They stayed like that for a long time. Eventually, she spoke. "She's walking now," she said. "You did that." Shadow didn't move, but his breathing slowed. The next morning at the center, Ash made a full circle of her enclosure without pause. Shadow watched, but this time, when she settled onto her log, he didn't stand up. He stayed lying down. He was still watching, but something had changed. The sky above Everpine was a clear, endless blue the morning of the rehabilitation event. The storm season had passed, leaving the hills clean and golden in the sun, and a rare stillness had settled over the rescue center. The gravel lot was lined with folding chairs, most of them occupied by local supporters, volunteers, and visiting biologists. A string of yellow pennants fluttered overhead, marking the edge of the outdoor enclosure that had been prepared for the occasion. The scent of pine mingled with the faint aroma of coffee from a small catering table, and laughter rolled in soft waves. But just beyond the noise, tucked into a quiet patch of clearing behind the center, a different kind of tension hung in the air. Quieter, older. Ash lay inside the smaller recovery pen, her ears twitching at every sound, her body tense but calm. She had gained weight, still lean, but steady on her feet, and her coat had grown in thick and dappled. The scar on her hind leg was less visible now beneath the fresh fur, though it would never fully vanish. She was ready. That's what the staff had said. Ready to return to a semi-wild monitored habitat further up the protected slope. They had arranged everything. But Ash wouldn't leave the pen. She had taken 3 hesitant steps toward the open gate, paused, looked back, and retreated into the corner. That had happened twice now. The third time, she hadn't moved at all. Mara watched from the outside of the enclosure, standing beside Ellie, who held her sketchpad against her chest like a shield. Shadow sat nearby, tethered loosely beside them, his leash slack on the ground, but his entire posture alert. He hadn't barked, hadn't whined, but his ears had been trained on Ash since they arrived. "We might have to sedate her," muttered one of the handlers, Rachel McKee, a slim, practical woman in her late 30s with wind-burned cheeks and sun-wrinkled eyes. She was experienced and usually kind, but she didn't believe in sentimental delays. It happens. Animals imprint during recovery. You have to break that bond cleanly if they're going to survive on their own. "No," Ellie said sharply before she could stop herself. Everyone turned. "She's not afraid," Mara added, quieter but firm. "She's waiting." Rachel raised a skeptical brow. "For what?" Mara looked down at Shadow. Rachel hesitated. "The dog?" Ellie stepped forward, eyes bright. "Just give them a minute." Dr. Keller, who had been overseeing the logistics from a clipboard nearby, walked over. She looked at Mara, then Shadow, then Ash. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Let him in. No leash." Rachel looked like she wanted to argue, but instead waved toward the gate. Mara leaned down and unclipped the lead from Shadow's collar. "Go on," she whispered. Shadow walked without hesitation. His gait was smoother now, his limp barely noticeable. He stepped into the enclosure with slow, careful movements, his head low, tail relaxed. Ash lifted her head immediately. The tension in her body shifted. Not vanished, but changed. Shadow walked until he was close enough to touch her, and then stopped. Ash stood. They didn't make a sound. No whine, no snarl, no rustle except for the quiet brush of fur as they leaned their heads together. It was not a long moment, but it was entire. Then, as if something unknotted in her spine, Ash turned. She took a step, then another. She paused at the gate, looked back at Shadow. He didn't move. Ash turned again and walked forward into the clearing. She didn't run, didn't leap. She walked with slow purpose until her body vanished into the thin line of trees, the soft rustle of underbrush closing behind her like the page of a book. A silence fell. Then applause. Mara didn't hear most of it. She had turned back to Shadow, who had stepped to the edge of the gate, sat down, and watched the forest as if he could still see her. "That was remarkable," came a voice beside her. She turned. The man was tall, mid-50s, with broad shoulders, a square jaw, and weathered skin beneath a salt-and-pepper beard. He wore a clean ranger green jacket over a crisp button-down, and his boots looked too new for the dirt. His eyes, however steel blue, steady held the weight of someone who had spent decades commanding trust. "I'm sorry," Mara said. "Do I know you?" "Name's Grant Turner," he replied, extending a hand. "I used to train tactical K-9s for the Wildfire Division out of Eugene." Mara shook his hand cautiously. "You're here for the release?" "Sort of," Grant said. "I came because someone sent me the clip of your dog with the lynx cub. I've seen that dog before." Mara stiffened slightly. "We had a German shepherd named Blitz assigned to a ranger named Hallis. Search and rescue dog. Strong instincts, sharp drive. We lost them both in the Granite Ridge fire last summer. Body was recovered. Dog wasn't." Mara's eyes dropped to Shadow. "He was presumed dead," Grant continued, "but he had a scar under his collar, right side, shallow loop, chain abrasion." Mara didn't answer. "I'd like to bring him back," he said, voice calm. "Reintroduce him to the team. If he remembers training, he could be invaluable." "He's not your dog anymore," Ellie said before Mara could speak. Her voice shook. Grant turned to her. "I appreciate how much he's meant to you both. I really do. But animals like him, if they were trained to serve, sometimes they don't get the life they deserve unless they're working again." "He's working," Mara said, finally finding her voice. Grant paused. "He's been working every day since the moment I found him. Not for pay, not for commands, because he chose to stay." Grant nodded once. He looked at Shadow, who sat at Mara's heel, tail tucked but relaxed. His eyes no longer scanned the trees, just the people near him. "I understand," Grant said, and he meant it. He left not long after. Later that night, back at the cabin, Shadow curled beside the fireplace. His eyes were soft. His breathing was steady. And Mara, for the first time since the day she lost her daughter, felt that something had come full circle. Not ended, just returned home. The first snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air had taken on that quiet, waiting quality, the kind that made mornings feel like held breath, and afternoons pass with a hush. It had been a month since Ash walked into the trees, and Everpine had returned to its usual rhythm, though nothing felt quite the same. Not to Mara, who now found herself leaving her porch light on for no practical reason. Not to Ellie, who had begun writing again, not just drawing. And not to Shadow, whose days had taken on a slow, steady grace, like an old soldier who had found peace but still heard echoes. Every morning began the same. Ellie, bundled in a forest green coat 2 sizes too big, her backpack slung over one shoulder, would walk the gravel path down to the school bus stop 2 blocks from Mara's cabin, and Shadow would walk beside her, step for step, until she reached the painted yellow line on the curb. There, he'd sit, not moving, not barking, just watching until she boarded the bus. Then he'd trot back up the hill and lie down by the front door, his eyes fixed on the horizon until she returned. People in town had started to notice. A photo of him sitting beside the stop had gone mildly viral on a local community page with the caption, "Guardian of the bus stop." Ellie had printed it out and taped it inside her notebook. She claimed it was cheesy, but she'd also outlined the words in gold gel pen. Inside the cabin, Mara had made room. Not just physically, though Shadow had claimed the rug by the fireplace, and had a drawer in the entryway filled with his things, but in subtler ways too. She no longer looked out the window with that faraway expression. Her walks in the forest were slower, more present. She'd even pulled down the box of Lena's things from the attic, not to bury them again, but to finally look through them. On a quiet Saturday morning, Ellie sat on the porch steps with a letter in her hand. Her fingers were pink from the cold, but she hadn't moved since the mail truck passed. Shadow sat beside her, head pressed lightly against her knee. The envelope bore a logo, Oregon Wildlife Preservation Fund. Inside was a short, handwritten note and a newspaper clipping. "Dear Ellie and family," it read, "the story of Shadow and Ash has reached far more hearts than we ever expected. Because of the awareness raised by your video and sketches, we received a surge in donations enough to fund 2 additional wildlife enclosures and expand our educational outreach. But more than that, it reminded people what kindness looks like when it's quiet and unconditional. Please find enclosed a reprint of the article that ran in the Oregon Life and Land feature this week." Ellie unfolded the clipping. A large photo showed Ash walking toward the trees, Shadow seated at the enclosure gate, the morning light turning their fur almost golden. The headline read, "The Dog Who Waited, the Lynx Who Walked." Beneath it was a short byline about the bond between species, survival, and choice. Ellie stared at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. She looked down at Shadow, his ears flicking gently in the breeze. "You know," she whispered, leaning closer, "I think you didn't just save her. I think you saved all 3 of us." Shadow turned his head slightly. His eyes met hers for a moment longer than usual. Then he rested his head on her boot. That afternoon, Mara suggested a walk. They took the longer trail one that led behind the cabin, past the creek where the moss was thickest, and into the grove of towering pines that filtered the sun into dappled gold. Ellie brought her sketch pad, of course, and Shadow walked just ahead, occasionally glancing back to make sure they were still coming. The wind moved like a whisper between the trees, and a few dry needles floated down in slow, lazy spirals. It wasn't until they reached the edge of the clearing that Shadow stopped. He didn't freeze or bristle, just paused. His ears turned forward. His body stilled, and his head tilted slightly toward the trees to the east. Mara followed his gaze. There, just beyond the ferns and half hidden in the underbrush, a flicker of movement, a shape, slender and wild, with tufted ears and golden fur just kissed by the sun. It didn't move closer. It didn't run. It stood perfectly still, watching. Ash, she had grown. Ellie gasped, her sketchpad forgotten in her lap. "It's her," she breathed. Mara placed a hand over her heart. Shadow didn't move toward her, didn't bark, didn't whine. Instead, he blinked slowly, then lowered his head. Ash watched for a moment more, then turned and melted back into the trees. And Shadow turned, too, not to follow, but to walk back toward Mara and Ellie, his steps unhurried, his tail swaying gently behind him. They didn't speak on the walk home. They didn't need to. That night, as they sat by the fire and the stars crept out above the cabin, Mara opened her journal for the first time in years. Ellie curled up in the corner with her pencils, and Shadow lay at the hearth, not guarding, not waiting, just resting. For the first time, everything felt still in the way stillness is meant to be. Not empty, but whole. Sometimes, God doesn't send angels with wings. He sends them with 4 paws, a broken past, and a heart that still dares to love. Shadow didn't ask to be a hero. He didn't choose his pain. But when he was given the choice to walk away or stay, he stayed. For a creature smaller than him. For a moment, bigger than him. And maybe, just maybe, he stayed for all of us. Because healing doesn't always come in grand miracles. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a dog who waits. Sometimes it looks like a lynx learning to walk again. And sometimes it's in the simple act of choosing kindness over fear. So the next time you see someone walking alone, or an animal that's been forgotten, remember Shadow and Ash. Remember that no soul is too small to matter. No story too quiet to heal. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment below, and subscribe to hear more stories like this. Stories of healing, second chances, and the quiet power of love. And if you believe God still works through unlikely messengers, type Amen in the comments, and may God bless you in every life you've ever helped, whether it walks on 2 legs or 4.